Thank you very much indeed, Anne. That was another fascinating talk, and great to have that perspective from Alaska there on the real challenges between managing the adaptations to impacts on infrastructure and coastal heritage. I'll now move on to our question and answer session for the speakers in this session. I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for a fascinating range of talks. We've heard different perspectives on sectoral adaptation plans from Ireland and Wales, and we've heard some contrasting examples of the impacts of climate change on coast and coastal heritage through hard rock coast. The fascinating example of the mega gravels, definitely putting the mega into gravel there, from Rona Cox, and also from Anne Jensen talking about the impacts on the softer coastline from those examples in Alaska. So thank you all for the very interesting set of complementary presentations there, and just like to now move on to the questions that have popped up in the chat while we've been going along. And I'd like to invite our speakers, that we can broaden this discussion out as well beyond those specific questions. So I'd welcome contributions at any point. But our first question came in and refers back to our first presentation from Dave and Christine, and which highlights the brilliant example from Fingal, and wondering when will this be followed by other local authorities in Ireland, for example the OPW, and are there other similar initiatives of management plans, heritage sites with regard to climate change in Ireland? So I'll address that one to Christine and Dave to kick it off. Thank you.
I think the takeaway from the work we've done so far is the need for consistency, both in consistency of methodology and approach. And I think that's very important at a national level before we start diving into maybe regional or county projects. It was the subject of the discussion at a recent archaeology and built heritage sectorial plan adaptation group meeting, the long titles. So yeah, I think there needs to be a review of data sets as well at a national level. I do know that OPW are piloting projects with different methodological approaches, say at Ballinskelligs, and also a colleague in reviewing the flood risk assessment is using cultural heritage as a factor. So that's another approach that's been run out. Dave, you might have something else.
Yeah, I think for those of you who saw some of the other sessions earlier on, Michael McDonough from the Department of Heritage, Local Government and Housing gave an example of a site plan in particular that's been impacted by extreme events in Kerry. So that could be one to look back on in the recordings of the particular conference. But I'd certainly echo what Christina said. It's great to see local authorities taking a lead on particular projects, particularly when they've been highlighted in the sectoral adaptation plan for archaeology and built heritage. But that's, I suppose, not to say that just because one local authority has done it, that every local authority should follow. I think from Christine's presentation, it was quite clear that there are issues around data availability, and not just for risk assessments on cultural heritage and archaeology, but for data availability on other sectors like critical infrastructure or transport, or indeed biodiversity. So the data piece is quite big, but certainly it's great that Fingal have commenced this project, and we were delighted to be part of the steering group. So hopefully the results of the project will be something to build on for other local authorities as we continue to implement the sectoral and local adaptation plans.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think, yeah, referring back to the earlier presentations for some of the additional cases, and I think it's also useful to mention here that in both the Ireland and Wales sectoral adaptation plans are examples from the CHERISH project, which feature in those which are helping to inform that policy context as well. And it's good to see. I think one clear message that's coming through is the momentum that's gathering in terms of the role that heritage can play in climate change adaptation and the increasing focus on heritage sites. and that sort of importance of cross-sectoral working, both within regions and at a national level, but across nations as well, and trying to learn from the approaches that we've been hearing about from Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England, and internationally as well. So I think bringing together those different perspectives has been a very important development as the sort of move towards adaptation gathers momentum. I just also now to move on to a question for to Rona here, and Rona, your presentation provided some powerful, both literally and metaphorically, examples of the impacts on hard coastlines, and we think a lot about the soft coastline and the impacts of climate change, and you know, the implications for the energy and the magnitude of what movement is possible in these environments. And that has quite big implications for coastal promontory thoughts. And just wondered, how far you've sort of been reflecting on that heritage aspect of your geomorphological work.
So yeah, that's a great question. And so to go to the first part, which is the focus on soft coasts rather than rocky coasts, there's a real rocky coast as depositional environments and as high energy zones as places where sediment is transported have really received very little attention over the years. And it's the rocky coasts in general are understudied. But when we think about rocky coasts, we tend to think about the erosion, the cliffs falling down, that sort of thing. And sediment transport in those zones has been really understudied. So the work that colleagues and I are doing, we think is filling a gap. And the heritage pieces of this, I first started thinking about when I met Kieran Craven actually at an IGRM conference a few years ago and learned about CHERISH and started to think about the fact that I was working on the Aran Islands and there are these coastal sites and were there ways that the work we're doing could intersect. And so that was the genesis of the kind of thinking that went into this presentation, because it's not the sort of thing that I was thinking about when I started looking at these boulders 10 years ago. And we're actually trying to take it a little bit further and look at the offshore setting and what might be below the cliffs and see if we can constrain rates of cliff retreat on the Aran Islands as they relate to the original shapes and sizes potentially of the sites where Dún Aengus and Dún Dúchadha are located. So we're beginning a project with the University of Limerick, their Centre for Robotics Intelligence, where we're going to do some subsea imaging of the areas right below those cliffs. And this is completely separate from the boulder transport stuff, but has grown out of it to see what might be done. It's a complete fishing expedition to see if there's stuff down there. Are there large boulders? Can we say anything about how long they've been there in terms of incrustation that might be on them? Are there indications that they're moving recently? Is there any sense that we can try to constrain the retreat rates for those cliffs on millennial rather than decennial timescales? So I would encourage anybody who's doing physical geography, geomorphology, sediment transport dynamics to start thinking about these environments, because worldwide there is so much work to be done.
Oh, thank you, Rona. That's, as a physical geographer, that's fascinating to hear, and I'll certainly be encouraging my students to think about those kinds of questions. And I think it's interesting, this hard rock, the rocky coastline has perhaps in adaptation and management planning has been seen as it's stable, so we don't need to worry about that so much. And clearly, your evidence is showing it's far from the case, and certainly needs revisiting. I had a question from a colleague, Howell Griffiths, who wanted to ask, are there any examples around Ireland of boulder deposits which have been buried or stabilised, or is the wave energy so powerful that this just doesn't happen?
That's a great question. Sort of long term, these are not the kinds of deposits that we expect to be preserved, because high energy coasts tend to eat their young, But the other thing too is that, particularly in the case of Ireland, where or the modern world, where post-glacial sea level rise, we think that many of these deposits have been migrating inland over time. So in these high energy environments, they are, especially in a time of rising sea level, they are unlikely to be preserved. There might be cases in the sedimentary record of places where there were these kinds of deposits, and then you had some sort of like rapid sea level rise and you managed to bury them in the same way that rocky coastlines of other sorts are sometimes but not often preserved in the record. I'm not aware of any, but then coastal boulder deposits as a particular target of investigation, that's also a very new field. About 90% of the papers that have been written on coastal boulder deposits are about 10 years old or less. So there are many. It's one of those things you tend to notice what you're looking for. So I'm sure they're there and just have been overlooked, but probably not too many of them. And around Ireland, I haven't come across any examples.
And presumably providing a chronology for those is quite challenging as well. And unless you have the examples like yourself where it's a very, very recent example within monitoring.
For some of the big deposits on the Aran Islands, we've been able to do some direct chronology on them because there are boring bivalves, actually very interesting bivalves, but bivalves that bore into the rocks, Hyatella arctica in particular. And we have found boulders that have these bivalves, and it's a subtidal organism. So we found bivalves that have boulders that have these bivalves entombed in them, and we've been able to pull those out and radiocarbon date them. So we know that we have medieval boulders in some of these deposits, and boulders that were taken out of the ocean as long ago as 2,000 years. So that helps, but because on the Aran Islands, they're limestone. It's difficult you can't do luminescence dating on them, for example. And so providing more precise chronologies is a really tough one, yeah.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated to see the inventive ways in which chronologies can be developed in these interesting environments. So thank you very much. And I just sort of turn our attention now to the sort of softer coastline and some of the challenges that you were talking about there. And I think really highlighted some of the dilemmas between adapting from an infrastructure and housing perspective, but also that then potentially has an impact on the heritage that is also being eroded and exposed. And so, and I think that's probably something that sort of affects all areas. But I just wondered from your perspective, if you could reflect on that. You talked about these, if you move inland, the infrastructure, you then start to impact on the sites themselves. How does that tension play out in terms of the policy and management sphere, and what are the ways in which the local community is addressing that?
Yeah, so far not really any. It's only now becoming an acute problem. It's been a problem that's been coming on for a while. The road where I showed that went by the National Historic Landmark Picnic, or the Burnham site. That road has been gradually getting shoved closer and closer to the site, into the subsistence cabins that are essentially the modern continuation of that site for decades. But it's always been incremental, and they've been fixing it. About 20, 25 years ago, they put up a big gravel berm along that road. They replenish the gravel berm after storms. There are times when they have heavy equipment in the surf pushing gravel up as the waves wash it back down into the water. I mean, I've seen people doing things that could have gotten them killed if there'd been a really big wave. And that was just what people were doing, and so there wasn't any concern about the site. And I think until fairly recently, people were not convinced that climate change and sea level rise were real. I mean, yes, the climate, but climate has always changed a little bit, sort of. So it wasn't any big thing. Now I think everybody's sold, but they haven't really faced up to how are they going to do it. They still haven't figured out about how to move houses away from the bluff, although it's clear that has to happen. Nobody wants to move. And there's also an issue of actually getting the lots, and further complicating that, the old part of town has an actual functional water and sewer system, which is subsurface. That has not been extended to new lots, and they couldn't afford to extend it the way they've got it in the old part of town. It was insanely expensive. And what they went to after that doesn't really work. As the climate's warming, there's constant leaks and pipe breaks, and they're very hard to find. And, it's been a nightmare. So, and nobody wants to move off the sewer system onto hauled water and sewage again. Although I have to say, since I live in a house with hauled water and sewage, it's actually more reliable than most of what people have in town. But, just perception is what it is. So it's really a challenge. And people value their heritage greatly, but they still haven't come to quite see that there's this issue here. And what are they going to do about it? The big seawall that I briefly mentioned, they're talking about building a big seawall. We had a major disaster, and it was federally declared disaster. So we can get a lot of money to help fix things. And they've been talking about trying to build some kind of coastal protection for probably 15 years or more. And it may now be possible, but, so there's been a lot of work from the, federal cultural heritage protection thing, but some of it is a little bit problematic because of certain community members not having quite bitten the bullet about having to move houses or the road and what to do, where to put that road to the boat launch kind of thing. Some people are, they don't need a boat, but those aren't people who actually have to go east. They're people who have cabins the other way. So there's a lot of political issues tied up in this, and until they get sorted, unfortunately, it's probably not really going to get addressed as thoroughly as it should be. I was kind of interested in the boulders because one of the things they're talking about for the seawall is boulders, as a large rock revetment. And frankly, I don't think the boulders they're planning on using are nearly as big as some of those you were showing. So I'm a little dubious about how the seawall is going to work now.
One of the things that we have tried to do is connect with engineers, because these coastal boulder deposits, a lot of them occur as seaward sloping ridges that are 1 to 7 meters high. And they are really analogs for a lot of these rubble revetments and breakwaters. And engineers characteristically test their designs for the strength of waves and flow energies that these things can withstand in scaled wave tank models, because there aren't many natural analogs for these sorts of things. So we've been talking to people like Jim Casey in Ireland about these results and saying, here are data that might be useful to engineers as they think about these design structures and how to avoid boulders being plucked out or just moved over the top. So yeah, that's a great observation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this discussion is really highlighting the need for this sort of cross-sectoral approach and multidisciplinary perspectives to bring to bear in these coastal environments. And I was just wondering, in terms of the discussion that we've just had about the two talks, which reflected more on the impact, how do these examples perhaps feed into the context on the Fingal coast and the adaptation plans that you're making there, and does it highlight any additional areas of concern or commonality with the examples that have been raised? Oh, Christine, I think you're on mute.
While Christine is coming in there, I might just mention, like, what got me thinking when Rona was talking about the power of nature to move these boulders 2.5 tons and larger is, if we can just tap into some of that Mother Nature's potential from a climate mitigation perspective in terms of cracking that nut of wave energy and offshore coastal. If it can move boulders like that, then it can generate energy and it can wean us off fossil fuels. I really thought it was fascinating. But if Christine's back online there, I'll let her come back in on the soft coast of Fingal.
Thank you. Oh. We're still
I'll try and talk for her then, and you can nudge Christine and tell me if I'm on the right track. Yeah, I think certainly in the because I live in Fingal, so I can talk about it to some extent. There is certainly a soft coastline in parts of Fingal, and some particular areas that are experiencing particular erosion. with residential and critical infrastructure impacts, as well as cultural heritage. And indeed, Portrane is one of those locations, and it's one of 5 locations that the Office of Public Works have started a coastal monitoring pilot on to do, I suppose, multiple methods of coastal erosion measurement, which will hopefully feed into a national programme. And then, down towards the east coast, there are obviously other areas of soft coastline, and moving around the south to the west that Rona's presented on. Obviously, we're moving into harder rock coastlines and cliff coastlines. So certainly both presentations, I think, fed into some of the impacts that we are experiencing across the local authorities area, and it is the local authorities that tend to be the first line of defence here in terms of staff getting out to deal with whether it be storm surges, roads flooded, trees down, erosion on the coast, and I think increased resources and national policy needed, particularly in the coastal area, to help deal with this future and existing climate impacts from extreme weather events. So certainly both took good ideas and examples from both of the presentations after myself and Christine spoke. And it's a pity that Jill's not here, because there was good analogies there, I think, between the Welsh programme and also the Irish programme too. I don't know, are you back up there, Christine, and can you chip in?
I don't know.
Oh, you are.
Okay. Well, you've said it, Dave, and probably better than I could, in terms of we have both, and it's actually, I suppose, it's actually frightening listening to Rona and Anne in terms of the impact that we're facing into, and I just hope this is studies like this and initiatives and the cross-sectorial approach are the first steps in working towards adaptation measures.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think you're absolutely right when you sort of say the local authorities are at the front line, and I think that's very clear from what your specific example in Fingal, and also what Anne's drawn attention to in Alaska as well. That and having these sort of national, international frameworks, but it's actually on the ground locally where these conversations and responses are had, and seeing how that sort of embeds within it is really important. So, and
that's our next piece of work, actually, is to take the risk assessment and look how that kind of ground truths locally, and how we can look at that in individual sites or smaller micro regions, and to involve the community at that level as well in monitoring and reporting and just raising awareness.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, we're drawing to the end of our discussion session. I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for a fascinating set of talks. It's given us lots of food for thought, and we'll be really interested to follow how these initiatives are rolled out in the future, and see what future developments are on these individual projects, but also in terms of that increasing integration between projects and approaches. I think there's a lot of exciting developments, as well as we're facing some scary issues in the future, but I think there's also some really interesting developments in how we can tackle these. And I think, although Jill couldn't join us in her presentation, she highlighted 3 areas which I think it's worth sort of reflecting on in terms of the Welsh sectoral adaptation, in a call to action to provide more evidence and to invite all sectors to get involved in sectoral adaptation plans, and to respond to the policy framework and get more involved. And I think we've seen some great examples of cross-disciplinary and a really wide range of perspectives here. So thank you very much all. We'll keep the conversation going offline, I'm sure, and people are welcome to get in touch with our speakers individually. I'd just like to finally remind you all that there is a live panel session starting at 3:45. And that's in the Dunberg room. So we're now closing the Dinas Dintle room. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much for your participation and your contributions. Thank you.